really an honor to be here, and not only to see how design is shaping Singapore, but how you're leading the way. What design can be not just for education, but for the world. And so I've already, as a designer myself and as an educator, I am constantly in observation mode, seeing what's happening. And so today, we're going to talk a little bit about a design challenge, a little context. But before we get into that, I'll just share a little bit about who we are at the D.school and who am I. And I work at the Stanford D.school. We affectionately call it the Design School or the D.school. And our number one priority is to unlock people's creative confidence to solve big challenges and make a positive change in the world. We believe that there are so many challenges facing our planet and the people that we live in and live with that we need more creative people, more novel ways of addressing them. And so this is a design conference, and we've got a wide range of designers in this room, some very experienced design champions, people that have won awards, and people that are newer to design. And so, has anyone seen this image before? Maybe I row of hands, a handful. I see some folks. If you're familiar with design, or if you're not, you could Google it right now. This is the Stanford design process that came out about, I think, 15, 18 years ago. It's pretty old at this point, right? And it was a process that, kind of backstory on this, that like somehow got out into the world and to some extent oversimplified the design process. It was like, oh, you do these things one step in a row and then you're done. And so when we first started doing design or design thinking, this was a great launch pad for helping think about how we take on design challenges. But it really underestimates how we do design. Anyone in this room that has done design challenges or take on design know that it is not a linear process, right? Empathy embeds everything. You're never done prototyping, and you're always ideating. You're constantly playing with this. And so we've taken, since we started in 2005, lots of ways of thinking about design and also designers. And so more recently, we came up with the design abilities. What are the crucial abilities that a designer must need in this world? And you'll see there's about 8 of them. And on the very top, the number one skill that we think a designer must have in this world is the capacity to navigate ambiguity, to sit, to endure, to play with it, and to hold space for not knowing. That's a sticky place to be in. And you'll see all of them, whether it's learning from people in context, experimenting rapidly, understanding research, build what we call moving from abstract to concrete communication, as well as what we call designing our design work. How are we thinking about approaching our design work? All of these are abilities that feel more like you're playing jazz, right? Making a song than playing one single note as a designer. They're like a soundboard that you get to mix up and down as a designer. And so we've been thinking a lot about this. And then most recently, we kind of reimagined and relaunched our undergraduate and master's design programs. And we came up with, I would say, 4 learning outcomes. The minister today spoke about what are the key attributes or learning skills or pillars of designers today. And we think ours are somewhat similar, but are these 4 things. The capacity to make in both existing and emerging mediums. We want our students not only making with the Post-its and paper, but making with blockchain, gene editing, AI. They need to get better at the tools of the future as part of their prototyping. We want them to be stewards of the planet, caring about people and the planet in which they are inheriting and serving. We also know that they have to be adaptive. They have to constantly be abrupt and ready to adapt to these changing contexts. And then lastly, we want to unlock something that AI can't do, which is that uniquely human creative spirit, that funky spark thing. They're like, whoa, someone did that? That unique human capacity. We need that more than ever. And so we think those are the pillars that we think designers must have in this world. Because right now, We have this huge context right now in the United States and in the globe. And some of you might be familiar with this statement. We're living in a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world. We call it VUCA in futures terms. And I think this has felt more real than it ever has before in our lifetime. Let me show you some examples. I did my research, as any good designer does, to understand the problem space before I came. And this came out last week, right? I see shaking heads. And I'm excited by this. I think it's bold, I think it's fantastic, but it raises a fundamental complex question. What is the purpose of education? It changes how we think what education might be. Is it just university and career? Or are we thinking about happiness, greater outcomes? That is a design challenge. That is the context in which we're living. Coupled with that, another context we're swimming in is climate. Right? That is this water that we swim in when we're solving these issues. Climate is all around us. Before I got here, Charlotte Lee, the beautiful media folks, was like, get ready for some hot weather. And I have been. But this is happening all over the globe. This volatile climate change is happening not just in Singapore. It's happening all over the globe. I have friends of mine who live in Hawaii and on Maui. And if anyone got to see some of the stuff that happened this summer and this past spring, you know, the Maui schools, and in particular Lahaina, were out of school for 4 to 5 months. Young people were climate refugees. That's happening. How do we deal with that? That might happen to us. It's happening across the globe and in communities around us. Again, this is what we're working in. It's the swim of the context we're in. And then most recently, right, we are seeing AI. Less than a year ago, ChatGPT launched in, I think, January or I think December, a little under a year ago. And I think it got to scale in 15 million in like 2 days or something like that. They just launched today a new GPT that has virtual assistants. Some people are saying, and it's radically changing. It is happening so quickly that even policy cannot stay up with it. So how do we as designers not only see the context that we're working in, but take on what I think is this fundamental challenge, which is this one. Educators must prepare students to thrive in a world that does not exist. How many educators in this room have heard that phrase or some way of thinking about it? Let me see your hands up. Anyone have an answer to that? I don't think so. It's kind of a comical statement if you think about it, because I, myself, was a K-12 teacher. I taught English and history, high school, middle school, and I heard this over and over at conferences. And I'm like, say what? You want me to do what? How am I gonna do this? It's really hard to do because no one in this room can predict the future, right? No one has a magic 8-ball that says this is what's gonna happen, let alone can we actually predict how the lives of our students might unfold. We don't know. They surprise us all the time. Not only is this challenge what we're constantly faced with, but it makes it really hard because we actually don't know how to connect with our future selves. This wonderful, I would encourage anyone to get this book. Hal Hirschfield this past summer put a new book out that says that people treat their future selves as if they are another person, a distant stranger. You can't physically, emotionally connect to the future. So when you think about climate, you think about trying to prepare for the future. If we can't even connect to the future, how are we going to solve that? In simple terms, when you think about connecting to your future self, it's not that surprising. Because when you think about saving for retirement, losing weight, making long-term challenges, right? They're kind of tough to do because it's some distant person. And so when we take both of those questions, as designers, we kind of did the classic what if, right? What if, instead of trying to prepare our students for the future, as if we know how their lives will unfold, what if we move to shaping learners who have the capacity to shape their futures? Right? We have a different framing, a different question about how we answer this question. And to answer this question, to think about how we shape, we have to think about how we approach the future differently. And when we think about the future, we often think about the future, right? The future is coming, like winter is coming. It is here, it's this singular thing, and you think it's this one thing. But in reality, there's lots of futures, right? There are multiple futures that can happen. And we don't know which one's gonna do. We actually don't really know. And so we have to start thinking not about the future, what we call futures, and thinking about how design and what we call futures thinking can be connected. Not just so we can really understand the problems of today, but get ahead of understanding the problems of the future. So there's another way to look at this. This is from Amy Webb, and she's a futurist. And what she has on here with my iterations as well is what we call the futures cone. It's the futures of possibilities. And there are lots of ways to look at it. But when we think about the future, not only are there multiples, but in detail, there are what we call plausible futures, things that probably could happen. There are possible futures, things might happen. There are probable futures, things that will happen if we don't do anything else, right? And preferable futures, what we really want to happen. And design, most of us in design, I would say, we spend our time here, right? In the short 1 to 2 years, 3 to 5 years, right? And so when we're thinking about helping young people prepare for their lives, how do we move from helping them think about what's going to happen here, but what are the possibilities here? So we've been playing with those pieces as a designer, and we think about these questions. What does futures thinking and design really look like? And it fundamentally, for us, asks these 3 basic questions. How might the world change and why? It's a pretty simple question, right? The second question, what might people need in those futures? That's a design question. That's a need-finding question. That's an empathy question. And then how might we create equitable, sustainable, liberatory futures? That's a perspective. That's a point of view. That's a call to action. That's a value. All of these combined, right, are skills that our students can do today. There's ways for them to do it. And so as an educator, as I was sharing with some folks at dinner last night, I was a history teacher. I taught AP European history, and I taught English. And I spent thousands of hours having my students research the past. They wrote case studies, they did every single thing about the past. But I realized in the last number of years is that we as educators, we teach the past. We need to get better at teaching the future. This is my colleague, Lisa K. Solomon. She is a futurist in residence at the D.school. And we've been working on what it means to bring futures and design together. And so I believe educators are futurists. They can, they should be, and I think we need to be. If we're actually going to solve all the issues that are facing our planet, our communities, and the families that we love, we need to get better of not just responding to what we call the urgent current. I was a principal, putting out fires, another way to say it, but thinking long term. As minister this morning, he talked about design elements. And one of the key things that we think about our designers need to do is not only designing data, data is a design, products is a design, technology is a design, systems is a design, experiences are design, but implications. We can design for long-term, intended first, second, and third order consequences. How do we get better at that? And so I want to share, in my last 10 minutes here, an example of how to get started. And we've been calling this empathy for the future. As I said, we have a tough time connecting it, so we need to start feeling the future, what it feels like. And so we've been developing an activity, an applied imagination, thanks, Han, activity, that asks people to imagine their future descendants. We ask them to think about a child that they love, and we ask them to think about that child's child, 75 years, a generation ahead. And they create portraits of those descendants. This applied imagination project asks them to think about, who is this person? What do they love? What kind of world are they living in? What do they care about? And really importantly, what kind of skills does this young person need to activate and live in this world? Not surprising when we ask them what the skills, they're not talking about coding. They're not talking about which algorithm or linear equation they need to know. They're talking about skills like humility, creativity, agility, care, human skills that allow them to adjust to this constant changing environment. So we've taken these portraits and we've created exhibitions at places like South by Southwest, the Smithsonian, and we've turned them into what we call halls of descendants, where people and communities get to walk through and see what are the visions of the future. What are ways that we actually can coexist on the human level, the core values and the core skills that we all want for our young people and for the generations ahead. And so this exercise, you can literally do it, it's pretty simple, is one of many that we've been developing at the D.school. You'll see a QR code, it is a prototype, but we're calling it the Library of Futures. Different ways to approach the future. Again, because if we actually have all these problems, we can't just solve them, we have to approach them differently. Not just assume we can solve it. And so you'll see we have 5 different approaches that we're playing with. 1, empathy for the future. This other exercise called tracing change over time. If you're in my workshop this morning, we're gonna play with that. This idea of seeking visions of coexistence. The world is pretty polarized now. I can say that in the United States, it's deeply polarized. So how do we get beyond binary thinking and actually seek visions where people can coexist with each other and the planet? What does that look like? How do we have our students see in multiples? The idea that if they just get into one thing and their life is over, can they see the multiplicity or the pluralistic view of their life? Or what Adrienne Marie Brown talks about, which is emergent strategy. Can they get better at knowing how to do that? And lastly, similar to what Hans says, can they get better at world building? I have like a fundamental belief that when we think about systems or systems thinking or how we change the world, we need to get better at world building. We're not just reimagining a different world, we're actually building a new one. And world building is a skill, it's applied imagination that we can all cultivate in lots of ways. And so I want to close in these last 5-6 minutes, if you will, with a gentle reminder, is that while all of us in this room are futurists, and we are, we're ancestors too. Every single person in this room will be, and are now, an ancestor to education. You will be remembered for the choices that you make or the choices you didn't make. And so we have to think about, we have to hold that as a responsibility. And let me just give you one example here. So this is my middle school self, grade 6, age 11, with a pretty bad haircut, I will say. I grew up in the Midwest, and so in the Midwest, you may not see this, but like, we used to wear turtlenecks. This is like classic 80s, like heavy turtlenecks, big sweaters, and we would have these awkward photos for yearbook. And so this is me, age 11, and I was in grade 6. And you know, I've got this pretty awkward smile, probably wearing braces, I'm pretty sure at that time. And I was smiling for this photo. But what's hidden within this photo or this idea is like, I was really scared in 6th grade. I thought I was stupid because I had an auditory processing disorder, which it made it really hard for me to learn to read. I struggled. I also had a speech impediment, comes up sometimes when I'm nervous, you probably heard some of it today, where my name was Wunsch. My brother, Jamie, I called Yamie, I couldn't even say his name. And so when I was sitting in those 6th grade classes, or 5th grade or 4th grade, and the teacher would do a read aloud, does anyone know what a read aloud is? probably some English teachers in this space, thank you in the back. I would sit and stare at that one sentence I had to read in front of the class. I didn't even know what people were talking about. I would just stare at that one sentence because I didn't want to mess up. I didn't want to make a mistake because that was like the moment. That's so scary for young people. And so I had all these preconceived notions about what it meant to be creative, what it meant to be intelligent. I got pulled out for special ed classes, you name it. And I had one teacher, my 6th grade reading teacher at the time, who made a very bold, not predictive decision. So in my school in grade 6, there were some options. You could go take more reading classes, which if you looked at all my test scores and what I was reading at, that's where I would have went. That's where I should have gone. Instead, this teacher put me in Spanish. So I started taking Spanish. And as soon as that class started, all of a sudden the world opened up to me. I learned the English language for the first time. I learned grammar for the first time, actually. And all of a sudden, I could hear and understand language in a radically different way. There is no way that 10 years later, again, grade 6, by the time I turned 21, that teacher would have known that I would get an undergrad degree in Spanish, a minor in Spanish. A few years later after that, I would move to Costa Rica. I would speak on stages like this in Spanish because she made this one decision to think about possibility, not prediction. That's what it means to be a futurist. That's what it means to be an ancestor, is how do we open up these possible futures to allow our students to step into that space and become themselves. And so I wanted to share that with you and think about yourself. 10 years from now, this is, again, I did a little bit of research. I think this is roughly still the system. Han will correct me if I'm wrong. And I think someone at dinner told me last night it's like the conveyor belt of education. I think someone referred it to it, right? So 10 years from now, what do you want to retire? If our system and our world requires us to be agile, how does the system become agile? To respond to the ever-changing nature of our world. 10 years from now, what will your students say about you? What decisions are you making today that in 10 years will have an impact on them? And then lastly, what is your community going to be grateful for? We live in service of others. The future is something we can feel. We have to connect to it. And we live in community with others. So even though we, at least in the United States, we live in an individual society, we have a responsibility to our families, to our students, to our schools, and our communities to think not just how do we prepare for the future, but how we shape something radically different for them. That's our job. And so as I close out, I want to remind us that you, everyone in this room, you are the futurist your student needs. These are choices that we get to make. And so as I close out with 1 minute to go, I just want to say thank you, and please stay in touch. And for those of you who are going to see me in the workshop, see you later.